China had severed itself from Western modernity, even at the level of the temporal plane. China literally discovered a different timeline, a different chronology. A lot of people have cataloged and categorized and thought about this Ukraine war in a lot of different ways. Everybody understands it as an event. We've seen the geopolitical aspect of it that I've given you from the Dugan perspective about the Russian world versus the Western world. You know, you've seen this in terms of a conflict of values between democracy and authoritarianism. And some, like Voss, would say it's a conflict between democracy and fascism. And the CPUSA is actually pretty sympathetic to that position as well. But what about the aspect of time? Nobody thinks about that now, do they? Nobody thinks about that. Nobody thinks about time as a worthy dimension. Why? Because time can't be represented in the same way space can, at least. Space can be easily represented on a map. When we talk about geopolitics, oh, that's easy. It's like a strategy game, right? You got the Russia here, the West here, and it's different bodies and territories interacting with each other in a very observable and phenomenally distinct way or intelligible way. So time is not something we really think about when it comes to having a political dimension or having a social dimension or having some kind of human dimension. Well, a good old fellow by the name of Immanuel Kant would have a problem with that view. According to Immanuel Kant, time is not some passive succession of change that just exists outside of us in the real world. For Immanuel Kant, the succession of change and the ability to experience time is transcendental. What that means, it being transcendental, is basically that it's part of the way in which we filter reality in a human way as human beings. As human beings, there's a difference between the reality outside of us and the reality we experience in our finite experience. And for Kant, these transcendental structures of the mind basically bend, twist, and filter reality in a way that makes it intelligible to our minds, or more specifically to our intellect. And for Kant, there are synthetic a priori categories, right, of the mind. Now, I'm not going to get into the analytic synthetic distinction and what the significance of that is, but synthetic a priori basically means it's a priori, but it's not just analytic. It's not just a logical axiom like A equals A. It's synthetic, right? It has content somehow. And the two synthetic a priori categories, the synthetic a priori aesthetic for Kant is divided into time and space. Time and space are synthetic a priori for Kant. But time, that means not just space, but also time. Now, we can see how space can be something, socially or transcendentally mediated. For example, if I pull up a picture of the Earth on a map, you're going to see a bunch of different countries and a bunch of different borders. Those are all man-made. So space, in this case, is something we as human beings are projecting onto our world and dividing in ways that are not given, or at least that are not, just out there. It has this involvement through our experience. Well, Kant also says the same thing is true for time. The way in which we measure time isn't just given. It's not like we're just here and that things are just moving and we're just passively observing it. We are filtering the succession of change. The way in which we experience time is transcendental. It's something that's conditioned socially and historically and societally and politically through institutions. Think of the Big Ben grandfather clock in England, right? It's this great big grandfather clock tower, which is regulating this singular and united, coherent experience of change in the form of the grandfather clock, linear time, chronic time, time that is irreversible, that flows in one direction, and which is more or less static and universal. So all of our experiences are united by the Big Ben grandfather clock. A day that passes for you is the same day that passes for me. The rate of change more generally in terms of how we measure historical events is shared by us in the same exact way. Think of news cycles or Twitter trending cycles, right, that you see on Twitter. We're all experiencing the same timeline together, right? A lot of communists or revolutionaries or socialists or leftists or radicals speak about the reorganization of society, usually in spatial terms. Who's going to cook the fucking food, and who's going to wash the dishes, and who's going to wash the toilets, and who's going to organize production here. And those are just like spatial arrangements, right? But nobody thinks about how time and the experience of time would change. And actually, the significance of time is very important within Marxism. Marx, for example, talks about the significance of labor time, right? Marx also talks about the significance of time when it comes to the circuit of capital, how money is accumulated. MCM, money invested in a commodity to produce more money or a surplus value, that's a time circuit as much as it's some kind of spatial arrangement of relations of production. So time has a very big significance within Marxism too. Time is not considered something passive and just out there. And of course, Walter Benjamin and some of these more esoteric Marxists have talked about the significance of time. Walter Benjamin recalled that during the revolt or the revolutions of the Paris Commune, revolutionaries allegedly shot the clock towers so as to arrest time itself, because time was considered somehow counter-revolutionary. Literally, counter-revolutionary. They shot these clocks to realize a moment that is outside of this unified, universalistic, modern, synchronous time or temporality. We never think about the subversive nature of time. It's not something we spend a lot of time doing. We think about subversion usually in spatial terms. For example, a partisan guerrilla, if you read my MAGA Communism Substack, which alludes to Schmidt, partisan guerrillas understand in spatial terms. A partisan is underground, below the surface. A partisan is dwelling in areas out of sight. These are all spatial or even geographic terms, often. Carl Schmitt uses the example of U-boats in World War I, used by Germany against Britain. So, partisan, the theory of the partisan, is also understood in spatial terms only. What would a revolutionary relationship to time really be? Now, let me get a little spookier and darker. What if the real change, it's a funny word, isn't it? Change. What if the real changes that happen in our reality, and which determine our reality, don't happen in a spatially apparent way? In the case of one country gobbling up the territory of another, or some kind of profound change in the relations of society that are overt and transparent to us, or, in some kind of even the overthrow of governments. What if the real changes that happen in our society are somehow invisible to us and are somehow happening at a very abstract temporal level? We understand that there's wars in spatial terms. What if there are wars on the temporal plane of existence itself? What if there's time wars? What if there's time travel? The notion of there being dissynchronicity and antagonism at the level of temporality seems inconceivable to us. And yet, how could you be a consistent revolutionary, or a Marxist even, without taking that into consideration? In the case of a spatial conflict, that doesn't really fall all by itself into the definition of war proper. Clausewitzian war, which is something I've alluded to earlier, is based on the principle of absolute enmity. Absolute enmity entailing actual antagonism, actual all-out war. But wars, as they were represented to us in popular imagination, seem like their outcome is already decided beforehand. Two parties with two co-synchronous and equally rational self-interests go to war, and it's on the same plane of existence, and it's not really a war. It's really just this thing that happens at the level of our shared experience and our shared reality. In other words, it's a squabble. Well, Carl Schmitt, recalling on Lenin's work on guerrilla warfare and the significance of Lenin more generally, said that that was what Lenin's perspective on World War I actually was. For Carl Schmitt, Lenin's view was that World War I wasn't even a real war. It was a petty squabble and dispute between the same ruling class, which preserved the same plane of existence and kept intact the very same continuum of politics and social relations. It didn't actually upset anything. For Carl Schmitt, a real war, from the Leninist perspective, is a revolutionary war. It's a civil war. Why? Because that kind of war is a war at the metaphysical level. It's a war at the level of being. It's a war at the level not just between two parties going at it, but two entirely different perspectives and projections of this transcendental plane of existence that we call human society. Two absolutely irreconcilable projections of being itself. That's a real war. Class war. That's what Carl Schmitt had to say about Lenin. So if we're going to fulfill the correct understanding of real war, or at least real Clausewitzian antagonism and a real revolutionary perspective, we can't just think of revolution in spatial terms. We have to take into account time. Just like how there are discontinuities in space, there's also discontinuities in time itself. Time isn't just this fixed, monochronic, succession of events. The way in which events succeed, or the way in which we take account or take note and observe change, differs. There's different ways of doing that. Now, that's a pretty, on the surface level, uncontroversial thing to say from a historic level. We've measured time differently, purely, at the level of having different calendars. The current calendar that we have isn't the same one that we had, 3,000 years ago, and that one wasn't the same as the one that was had before. Different geographies have different calendars. There's a Chinese calendar, there's an Islamic calendar, there's the calendar that we have. There's even the Gregorian calendar versus the one that we have that prevails now. So there's all sorts of different ways of measuring change. Now, the question is, are those just different ways of measuring the same kind of change or the same chronology, the same timeline? Is there one interrupted timeline and these are just different ways of measuring it? Well, is there one polity? Is there one territory? Is there one geography? No, it's an absurdity, right? You can see across history how all of those things have changed. Time changes too. Now, that's a provocative insight, but it's also a pretty scary insight. If time also changes, how do we know that what we experience as reality is as uninterrupted and continuous as it appears to us? What if there's changes occurring right before our eyes that we don't notice, but which nonetheless determine the actual outcome of our reality? It's pretty paranoid, isn't it? What are the elites doing behind closed doors? What are the real forces moving and driving our reality? What are they up to? What are they planning? What's going on? Intuitively, in our gut feeling, we feel this. We feel there's something going on behind the scenes. The problem is that we usually just jump the gun and just assume this is happening at the spatial level, behind closed doors. Waste. Thank you, Julius.
The Inca measured time by how long it took to cook a potato.
Yeah, sure. We measure time. Intuitively, we can all sense these disturbances. And we usually understand these disturbances in terms of conspiracies, that magic is being practiced by the mass media. There's an occult that the policies and the events and the things that we experience are laden with this occult quality, right? This mystical quality that we can't quite parse together. But we immediately jump the gun and we assume that this is in spatial terms, right? That there's a cabal literally behind closed doors. That's a spatial projection and spatial representation. What if the real conspiracy is happening not at the spatial level, but at the temporal level? What if that's where real conflict occurs? Disturbances at the level of time don't really change our reality in the most overt way, but they do change our reality in the most real way. Even the way in which we depict time travel seems to be overdetermined by the prejudice of spatiality. In the case of time travel, it's like Back to the Future, where we go to a different place. What does it mean to go to a different time rather than go to a different place? In the case of going to a different time, you're not traveling to the 1960s and literally being there. You're traveling to a different timeline, a different chronology. Not only a different measurement of the succession of change, but a different consistency as to the way change succeeds. That in and of itself is a completely different timeline. After China's reform and opening up, China more or less had already gone through what would have been the equivalent to us as the end of times, apocalypse. China punctured the world of appearances at the level of phenomenal reality in its search for the true content, the true revolutionary essence of all things. That was the Cultural Revolution. And eventually, the Cultural Revolution came to an end. Came to an end because after having searched for a true form of proletarian culture, what it basically did, in actuality, was destroy every instantiation of phenomenal reality as a privileged site of being. In other words, phenomenal forms no longer became the privileged site of the essence of all reality. No book, no play, no music, no TV show, no consumer good, no object, no brand, no painting, no poem could suffice to exhaust the universal truth of, let's say, the Chinese Revolution or communism. And so the essence of Chinese communism became something transcendent and transcendental, lying only in the occult secret of the party, standing above and therefore beyond the world of phenomenal forms. China, more or less, to put this in different terms, concealed the revolutionary essence. It didn't destroy it, it concealed it. It was concealed in the very structure and form of the party. And in Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening up, it's not as though the party protected and insulated itself against this seeming importation of capitalist relations. Those apparent capitalist relations, which, spoiler alert, were not capitalist relations at all, these apparent circuits of capital accumulation appear to us as capitalist relations. In reality, they fulfill somehow. They measure, they are the manifestation of a socialist chronology. They're moments within the 5-year plan, mere moments within a greater plan that was decided beforehand. China, after its Cultural Revolution, didn't simply didn't actually join the Western world, it severed itself so completely that, in contrast to the Soviet Union, which had merely severed itself from Western modernity in spatial terms as a separate sovereign territory, China had severed itself from Western modernity even at the level of the temporal plane. China literally discovered a different timeline, a different chronology within which it measured its own existence. It measured the succession of change happening within its confines. Pretty spooky, right? Deng Xiaoping said, "We have to bide our time and hide our strength." All the while that it appeared China joined globalism, something very different was going on. China was on a completely different trajectory because it was measuring history in a completely different way at this point. And so, what we experienced as the triumph of liberal democracy, China was experiencing as a moment within a bigger plan, a much bigger plan, a plan that couldn't even be perceived within the frame of liberal modernity. It was somehow outside of it, yet responsible for its movement. China became this kind of transcendental hyper object, moving our history and moving the succession of history while being imperceptible to the narrow confines of its prevailing measurement. So a great schism had occurred at the level of the very measurement of chronological change, at the very level of the continuity of time. And this did not openly manifest itself at the level of a political or territorial dispute. It was simply this hidden thing that happened in a reality that seems like it's the same, but it's not. China is a different reality. It's like a completely different world. But it seems like it's the same world because no rupture at the level of spatiality has occurred until Russia's special military operation, which began in late February 2022.